What was your, structurally, that you are so interested with the structures that you play with your films, now going to the mind of this guy, where you have such a massive amount of information and important things to play, I would like two things. What was the first spark that got you into, I need to make a film about this guy? What was that moment, if you remember, what was the connection? What kind of connection you made with him? And secondly, in order to get what you got in this 3-hour movie, to reduce everything in this short amount of time, a life so complex, what was the spine? Meaning, what you left out and what was the guidance for you to say, this is what is imagining you. It's easy sometimes to write, as in Dorking or other films that are incredibly complex in terms of action, with the Germans attack, or whatever we would like to write as filmmakers in the page is very easy. But then when you have to produce it, that's another story. So as a couple, I want to ask you, Emma, how you deal with this relation, and suddenly when you read these scripts, and suddenly you are discussing about all the challenges of making whatever Chris dreams, how you deal with this relation about what is, how you say, Chris, this is impossible, shut your mouth.
Yes.
How that works?
Well, it's different on every movie, to be honest. I mean, I think that the interesting thing, I think the hardest one to really sort of imagine how we were going to do everything in the script was actually Inception, because that was sort of massively ambitious just from a sort of production. I read that script and I just didn't understand what he had in mind.
I want a divorce tomorrow.
You read a thing where it says, that basically Paris folds up in front of somebody's face and you're like, how are we going to do that?
And with Leo DiCaprio there, that's another time.
That's another story.
That was more difficult, that part. I'm joking, okay? Watch out tonight. Social media is terrible. The humor doesn't translate well. Sorry.
But this film, it was actually kind of interesting because I felt like when I read the book, that was when I really didn't understand how we were going to do this, because it's, as Chris said, it's just an enormous book, and there are so many elements, and I couldn't really understand how he was going to digest that and make it sort of, make it digestible for a sort of an audience. I knew he wanted to make it as a summer blockbuster, and that really seemed challenging to me. It wasn't so much the production challenges, it was more, okay, well, how is he going to make this something that people are going to want to watch and be entertained by when it's about such a huge subject? I knew it was going to be an R-rated movie, in so many ways it was challenging, and I think it was more a sort of business challenge than it was a sort of logistical challenge. Except that I also knew that we were going to have to, all the conversations we had early on was, well, we have to make it for a reasonable amount of money if we have any hope of working again. And so that's where the sort of challenge came, was sort of trying to figure out how to make something that was so epic in scope, but for, probably half what anyone else would make it for.
That's a great point, because honestly, when success arrives, it's true that people say, it's obvious, it's Oppenheimer, come on. But it's such a risky film in terms of subject, and so there's a lot of conversations, intellectual themes, complex. And actually, I think it's one of the most incredible quiet films that you have in terms of action and staging, you know what I mean? So, it's a locked camera, mostly with great kind of shots, but it's about the ideas that were behind these people and the context. So you were very conscious about that. And I would like to ask you, grammatically, you could have made a very stagey, powerful, muscular film, some of yours, but you suddenly decide to have an incredible, huge camera, in incredible small rooms, faces, dialogue, and that grammar of steals. and how they flow, the architectural flow of each of them. So, I mean, is that was something that you conceived very early, or you arrived to that conclusion that that's the way quietly I want to show and be observing these people like that? Because it was not your style necessarily, it was something that is new for me.
Yeah, I mean, the way I approach those sort of issues increasingly, as I've gotten older, done more films, I have increasing confidence to not plan too far ahead in terms of technique, and so involve people, involve Hoyte van Hoyte, my director of photography, Ruth de Jong, the designer of film living, and start exploring where does the story take us. Hoyte and I, we've used the IMAX format for years, these huge cameras, and over the years we've become more and more interested in what it could do to the face. It gives you landscapes, it gives you epic shots, but it also does incredible things. It's like portraiture, it's like medium format photography, shallow focusing portraiture. And so on that huge screen, faces really come to life. And so you start making a series of choices, and a feeling as you start to do hair and makeup tests, and you make choices like, okay, can we make black and white film? Could Kodak make that for us in large format, which you've never done before, so that we could do the black and white as well as the color. And then we start screening these tests on an IMAX screen, and that passion that you develop for how things work, you start to develop the whole world of the film, to the point where late in the prep process, we needed to find our room 2022, which is the number of the room where the security events took place. And it wasn't a glamorous courtroom, it was this very, Strauss really tried to sweep the whole thing under the rug. And Ruth and I found this really shabby sort of room in this old factory that was about the size of the real room. And it was tiny, it was 7 feet wide. So we got Hoyte there and we said, look, we're thinking maybe we should actually shoot in this real room. And is that crazy? Do you think we can do it? And he totally loved it. He was like, no, that you want to show how intimate, how raw this whole thing was, how the people who were testifying against him, he's sitting 3 feet behind him on a couch. All that was how it happened in real life. So we took this huge 3 foot long IMAX camera and just jammed it into the room, and we jammed under the table, and people in the next room, and it was weeks of horrible claustrophobia, but you felt it play the drama, you felt the actors respond all crammed in there, and you also, visually when you look at the dailies, you felt how unpleasant and small that was. And
the sound of that camera. The intimate thing, you have to talk a lot.
It was a combination of things. A lot of it is what we call dry takes, which is what I learned. I mean, Aero and I learned doing 16mm films, independent films, which is where we started, where you would just, run the takes, and then turn the camera off because you couldn't afford to do any more takes with the camera. So then you just run the scene, you record dialogue again and again. And with software these days, with Pro Tools and everything, it's very flexible in terms of fitting dialogue once you've done that. So very often it's a case of either shooting with a quieter camera, alternate takes, or just doing dry takes and using those. So a combination of different techniques.
That's amazing technique. I would like to say too that something that gets my attention is Murphy, the actor, basically gives very little. And this camera, it's like our faces is like a map, right? I mean, it's a map of our lives. So you think you see a guy that has had a miserable life. He has a miserable face. Right? Am I? Are you laughing about it? So in a way, the face of him, in a way, it gives up very little. And it's because obviously the camera is just there and it grabs every porous kind of thing. You see everything. And so I appreciate very much that, because I had to understand that Oppenheimer was exactly the definition of reality, which is paradox and contradiction, right? And he was not even know what he was doing. And you put the camera on him. So he's a very silent character, the way that I didn't know too much about him. At the same time, I want to ask you something. There's a lot of music, all the time. And it's a paradox that such a silent character, suddenly there's music. Can you explain me how the music, the dramatic, will work for you? What you were looking at the music adding in the whole movie mostly? So what was that? Because it creates a tension, a dramatical tension. What was the logic about that? I want to understand your process.
Well, the process for me with music is I never use temp score, so I never use existing film score. I evolved the composer very early. Ludwig Göransson did an amazing job, I think, with the music on this and for Tenet, the previous film. I didn't have preconceptions about the music beyond I wanted it to be based on the violin, because it felt like the violin could give you that shift between awful tension and romanticism, just in the playing and in the feel of it. So he took that and he did demos, gave me tracks before we even started shooting. So I had some simple ideas already, and then we start layering that in as we watch the film. And the way Jen, who edited the film herself, we first cut silently, and just with dialogue.
Wow.
Then we start putting in sound effects, and then we start layering music. And I think every film I've ever done, I mean, I think even when you first see it, there's not a lot of music, and we all go, yeah, it doesn't need that much music. And somehow, 6 months later, everything's got music. And how did that happen? But it grows naturally, and so we, Emma and myself and Jen and Ludwig, we watch the film every week. Every Friday we'd screen the whole thing, look at what he had done for us. He would go away and work for a week, and as we would find the cut, we'd find the music. Because to me, the music just has to be an integral part of the film. It's not a source that we layer on afterwards. It's sort of growing with the narrative and helping the narrative. And so, as far as the logic of how things work, it tends to be more instinctive than that. I will say in the last act, the focus on the security hearings, I did go to Ludwig and say, I need a piece of very rhythmic music, very tense music. I want to play this like a thriller. And it has to sustain for, I mean, eventually it became like 10 minutes, but the first cut, I think it was half an hour or something. So I was having to give these tracks to just keep that tension. So it evolves over time.
So it was something that you discovered in the post-production, that you were adding, and suddenly it started feeling, your feeling needs to be there. It was not planned that way.
I mean, I have to point out that, I mean, Ludwig is involved even, when Chris was talking about the hair and makeup tests that we were doing in pre-production, Ludwig was there then. Like, he came and, we were sitting watching the, even when we were doing hair and makeup tests, we also had a visual effects and special effects team sort of shooting endless minutes of the crazy visuals for the physics of the thing. And we would sit there for just mesmerized by those images on the screen. And Ludwig was there from that point on. So he's an integral part of the process, even before we started shooting proper. But it is a very organic process in terms of that, as Chris said, we watch every Friday, and it builds as the music does.
I want to say too, one of the most incredible moments of the film is obviously when the bomb explodes, right? That's kind of a moment that we are expecting, and it's very elegant way of the way you deal with it, because it's silent. So I mean, the most loudest moment in the world ever, you turn it into a very silent moment, almost like a mourning, almost like in eternal mourning, which I want to put another thing that is the point of view, which in a way is the point of view of him all the time. And in that moment, it was so clear that suddenly I was in Oppenheimer body saying, what the fuck? I'm not listening even to myself. And I like the elegance, because it could have been the classic disaster movie of a bomb with CGI shit and all that. But he did it in a way that it was more about what he was feeling. I was very, very, very incredible moment, memorable. Combined and juxtaposed with the music that is constant, that moment felt like relevant because it was silent. And with the images and what we know what that consequences will be in the life of all of us now, our kids. I have a question of structure and decision, which for me is crucial, and which I think I understand what I want to ask you. I will tell you what I thought, but maybe I'm completely wrong. But it's important for me to understand what you thought, Paul, which is, after the bomb, suddenly everything turns into this incredible circus of political witch hunt and communist and accusations and all that, which speaks a lot, in my point of view, and maybe I'm wrong, about the double moral of a government that sustained that and then killed the guy who really made that for them. And then this guy, for me, that suddenly turned his head to other, like, well, yeah, it was a bomb, but I didn't kill 100 Japanese. Right? And then it turns into this political turmoil. But for me, suddenly there was another way, which is the consequence of now, that the world we are living, which in a way for me was AI, climate change, I mean, all these oil fucking guys, and all these AI guys, that they are doing the same. Frankenstein creator with no responsibility. And suddenly when it turns into the political accusation, suddenly I thought, what was that decision about? And not maybe to go to Japanese people die, the things that we are able, so all the things that triggered. What was your intention about suddenly to realize or to put that in the middle and the third act of your movie about that accusation? What means for you that moment of suddenly how the country turns to him and how that? I mean, I would like to understand, am I right about that is a comment about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a line in The Dark Knight that I wish I had written, but my brother wrote it. Where it says, you know, you either die a hero or you live long enough to become a villain. And when my brother put that in that script, I was like, that sounds cool, but I don't know what it means. It's like, no, I'm like, all right, well, you know, I sort of trusted him and left it in, and it's over the years, it's one of the things in that film that stuck with me and has grown more and more. And when I looked at this story, I felt very strongly that particularly in American culture, I think, that tends to be, you know, the arc of public figures, and people who get very involved in extremely important and sometimes controversial events. You know, you see this happening with public figures regularly, and I think in the case of Oppenheimer, that was very much sort of forced upon him. What I found in the story, and you should speak to it, but what I found was there was a moment. This was the first time scientists had ever got involved in a war. It was the first time they'd ever sort of, you know, truly like won the war, essentially. And so American society in particular turned around and went, okay, you scientists, you're in charge now, you tell us where to go, you know. And that lasted just about as long as it took the establishment to figure out that they needed to get rid of that impulse. And Oppenheimer became the kind of sacrificial victim of that. That's an aspect of it that underlies all of this. It's like they couldn't have people like Oppenheimer who had such credibility with the rest of the world and considered this genius who owned, you know, atomic power and would pontificate, would talk about what should be done with it. I don't think that was a tenable thing in the sort of American power structure. And so, more visibly than any other individual that I know of in history, he had to be immediately sort of, you know, put in his place, essentially, taken out of the equation. And a lot of the things he did that seemed possibly naive, or a little strange, or a little, you know, for such a strategic mind, I think a lot of it was his attempt to continue to have a voice in what was going on. Partly out of a sense of, perhaps out of a sense of guilt, but also out of a sense of trying to help the world. But you should speak to it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, what you said. No, I mean, but I find the sort of that you know, that half of the film fascinating, because for me that's kind of all I mean, that's how I didn't know that much about Oppenheimer until I read the book, and you know, I knew sort of what Chris had told me, and you know, he referenced it in Tenet and so on. But what I really knew about Oppenheimer was a lot to do with the way he was torn down later, and as somebody who's always had a sort of interest in history, I find it kind of fascinating to watch that bit of the film and really think about how much of what we understand of what has come before us is dictated by politics around, you know, sort of events in history, and they're not necessarily related to the truth, objective truth of what has happened. Of course, what objective truth is, you know, who knows? But it's just a sort of, to me, the whole story is a story about, you know, actions and consequences, whether that be the bomb itself, but also the act of making the bomb, and the fact that that could not be allowed to just live, you know, on its own merit.
Is there was a lot of construction or a lot of locations? So what was you build a lot of sets?
We tend to, with wherever possible, shoot on location. Obviously, and I actually had never been to Los Alamos until we got into this, but the Los Alamos that we're talking about in this story no longer exist. It is now
Nothing.
a very modern town. I mean, you know, the lab is still there. We actually shot in some of the real locations that still look kind of the same. So the house that they lived in Los Alamos, the Fuller Lodge, where, you know, the big rally takes place, that looks very similar. But the exterior of the town looks completely different these days. You know, there's Starbucks in every corner. So we had to build the town as they built it, which was a massive endeavour. But we had a very talented production designer and a big team.
Massive because the size of it, or what was the challenge about it?
We had to build roads to get to it. You know, we were also on the top of a mesa, and again, you know, budget issues. But we found this fantastic. Chris and Ruth found a location that doubled very well, and it looked, I mean, so spectacular. And I think really communicated the isolation that these people were having to live in while they built the gadget. But yes, I mean, really, for the most part, we were on location, even if there were sort of sets that we had built on location, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I've always found that real world scale is impossible to reproduce with sets. I mean, you know, the size of stages, the restrictions of them, being in a real place, or building into a real place. You know, for me, the best way to get the real world feeling of scale. And Ruth did an incredible job building those exteriors. I had originally wanted to build interiors and exteriors on the same set so that we could kind of live in Los Alamos for months and wait for the right weather and that kind of thing. It wasn't practical, the budget we had, and so she revisited Los Alamos, as I was saying, some of the interiors there. So we got to be part of that history of Fuller Lodge and the Oppenheimer's house. So then we balanced between the places. So we had to finish shooting our exterior set very quickly. We weren't there very long. But we got lucky with the weather. We got the weather we needed. The storms came in as we needed, and so it all worked out. And then for the Trinity test, Ruth and her team, they just built a replica of the 120-foot tower. They built it exactly the way it was. I went to the real Trinity site with Ruth. It was too difficult to shoot there because it's still a live, you know, army firing range. And they only open it twice a year, I think, or whatever. So that wasn't practical, but what she figured out was to just go further down the same mountain range and find private land that matched. And so she built this extraordinary replica out in the desert. And that just gives you such a connection with history, such an exciting feeling of what those people have gone through.
One of the fascinating things that I like about the film is the sexual life of Oppenheimer. reading the Kama Sutra naked. I love that scene. He's naked, reading the Kama Sutra, and I don't know, are they going to make love, or they made it, or are they talking about it? But I would like to know, what was your approach to that? Because it's obviously a big thing about his own inner life, and you portrayed him almost a very, I don't know if he was an intellectual, sexual guy, or he was, I don't know, but it's only like a womanizer, but you know, he was kind of maybe as an intellectual sense. I don't know what was.
Maybe we should take we are blaming each other.
What was the restrictions?
No, the importance of his sexuality from the reading of American Prometheus, it was very clear that he was someone who he was a late bloomer sexually, and he dealt with an incredible amount of, call it nervous energy, neurosis, as a virginal young man trying to explore these very, very high-level intellectual ideas about quantum physics and the stresses and strains of inter-Earth's relationship, which he was suggesting that when we cease to understand the world, these guys who are dealing with this absolute shift in how you even conceive of atoms and things like that. Huge mental effort. But what I wanted to find was this thread of energy in him, of visual energy, the visualizations. I wanted to treat it almost like a superpower he hasn't learned how to harness or something. And sexuality was very much part of that. And I think Florence Pugh playing Jean Tatlock, when she says you just need to get laid, or whatever, I think she's onto something, and I think he pivoted very quickly in his 20s to be a ladies' man in a major way. It was a huge part of his life. And there was no getting around, and this is why, when I first talked about it, it always had to be an R-rated film, because there's no getting around if you're going to examine the whole security proceedings against him, all the accusations against him, you can't ignore the fact that while he was engaged in the most secret wartime project that there's ever been, he was cheating on his wife in a sexual relationship with a communist, a known communist. And he went and spent the night with her. There are people who will give a tortuous interpretation of that event and say they didn't sleep together, they just chatted and whatever. I don't know, I wasn't in the room. I know what I think from what I've read, and I think it makes his story much richer and much more interesting to realize that he did make terrible mistakes. It's not entirely different from this basic theme of I didn't want to make a film about scientists who were too stupid to realize how bad nuclear weapons would be. They knew exactly what they were doing. They just felt and believed they had to do it because they were in this race against the Nazis. And so it makes it a much more compelling story to me that they're having to do these things. And so Oppenheimer in all those aspects, in all the ways in which that nervous energy manifests itself, and we literally, we show the background behind him kind of shaking at times and things. We try to find visual and oral representations of this sort of inner energy that's reflected in the physics of the energy he sees in dull matter. He sees in this, he sees energy, everything's made of energy waves, and so the release of that ultimately is this incredibly destructive force.
It's very, in that sense, it's exactly right. I mean, it's the only escape he had. No, I mean, of his mind and all that. Do you think? It's a question for both of you. Do you think at the end he really realized what he did? That what was the consciousness that he had, or he was willful denial? I mean, if there was something that he denied, what do you think about if he really understood what he did?
I mean, gosh.
Maybe.
I mean, he was a smart man, so he has to have done it. What's interesting to me is I think that when I truly understood how Chris was going to make this film was when he said that he figured out what the end of the film was going to be and described the last shot and the last lines. And to me, I mean, how could he not? I mean, I think that Nolan is a very powerful thing, but how could he not have understood what he was?
No, but that's very. I like what you said. Is what you think that he knew. Nobody knows. But what do you think, Chris?
I mean, the thing that drew me to the story was the third act, was the second half. Once I sort of learned more about it, because what you see in his story is a person who very, very cleverly, intellectually, with incredible rationalizations, never ever apologized for what he'd done. Never said specifically that he was sorry about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There was none of that. But his actions are the actions of a very, very guilt-ridden person. And so he would claim not to feel guilt. He would say that, you know, that wasn't, you know, there was a play that was written about him where they gave him a monologue where he was sort of desperately sorry and guilty about what happened. And he was angry about that and denied that that was his feelings about these things. But if you look at everything he did in regard to the hydrogen bomb, everything he did in regard to trying to push the government to a particular type of policy, push the world towards one in which nuclear weapons were regulated internationally, they are the actions of somebody who absolutely understands the consequences of what he's done and is trying to make it better. They are the actions of a guilty person.